Hello and welcome to the Leathercraft Masterclass with me, Phil. And in today's podcast, I have some juicy and somewhat controversial topics to talk about in the leathercraft world. I know it's been a while since I did my last podcast, and I say that a lot because it's so difficult to fit them in around doing the courses and the editing and running the business and everything, but I try to, and I found some time. Let's do a podcast. Now, before we start, I realize how green I am. And for those of you who are listening and wondering what the hell I'm talking about, I sat down in front of the camera and looking at myself in the screen there, and I can say I'm wearing a green top with a green flat cap with green leather-bound headphones with a green boom arm. I've even got green on the microphone. Luckily, I'm backed by red, so you can see me. Okay, so let's talk about the subjects that I'm going to be discussing today so that you can kind of get a feel for what we're going to be talking about. A couple of these things have been mentioned to me in the past, and some of them I've kind of found online, and I thought, you know what, this would make a great subject to talk about in a podcast. And a couple of them are from forum members who have asked questions on the forum, and I've thought, again, great subjects for a podcast that I could talk about, something that doesn't require, heavy visuals. So at the beginning, we have four main subjects. So the beginning is the increased use of AI images in bags on social media, something that I want to discuss. The next one is a mirror polish burnish. Is it worth it? The third thing I want to talk about is leather drop-in linings, and this was a question asked by a forum member on what are they and how to do it and how would you measure for one. So this is an alternative, something I haven't actually done in the masterclass before in the courses. I'm thinking now it would be high time to actually do or create a bag project with a drop-in lining so that people have those skills, but I'll talk about it a bit today. And lastly, how to make durable leather cutting patterns. How to make durable leather cutting patterns. So when you cut out a leather project, obviously we use patterns to cut around or at least mark before cutting. And if you want something durable that's made of metal or not MDF, hardboard, that's great, but you need machinery to cut that out that not many people have. The alternative is cardboard. However, after repeated use, it starts to show wear and you lose accuracy on it. So how can we get around that? I've come up with an idea that I've used in the past that I thought I'd share today so that you can make something for yourself that will last, but you can cut out with a craft knife. So let's start at the beginning with the increased use of AI on bags on social media. So I remember where I was in Egypt at the time, and I can't remember if I was sitting by the pool or in my hotel room, whatever the case, I was scrolling through Instagram. And I remember scrolling through and seeing this really unusual, quite remarkable looking bag. And I was kind of studying it and looking at it and thinking, wow, this is incredible. This is amazing. I can't believe that someone actually made this. It was a really intricate design. Just the way it was sitting on the desk, it looked absolutely flawless, absolutely perfect. Too perfect. So I kind of did what everyone does when they're studying a new design or something interesting that they've seen, something that inspires them. Kind of zoom in a little bit and take a closer look. And I remember thinking, that seam doesn't go anywhere. That's odd. Or that buckle doesn't look quite right. The tab's going the wrong way round. And very quickly dawned on me that this image that I'm looking at isn't reality, but it is in fact an AI image. And I went down to the comments because I thought, okay, people are going to be ripping this apart, surely. And it was a mixture of, wow, this is amazing, and where can I get this from? Where can I buy this? How much is it? Like, people were genuinely fooled by this. And it's only really because I'm a leather craftsman that I can look at it and go, that looks too perfect, and the design's off, and there's a lot of stuff that doesn't make sense. But if you're not used to that, and you don't have that kind of knowledge, you can see why people will be easily fooled. And I think, if I remember correctly, this account was selling bags that were, I did a little bit of digging, made in the Far East, but they're resellers, and they were putting AI images to just kind of get a bit of attention on social media. So the bags that they were showing that were AI images aren't something that they can make or have made. So it was interesting that they were even doing that in the first place, and I think they were mixing it up with bags that they sell and these perfect AI images. So it's probably quite confusing for people looking at it, for whatever the reason. And that was that was well over a year ago now. So I'm sure that AI images have even improved since then and become more convincing now than ever before. Now, I'm all for progress and technology, although I do something that's very, hands-on and crafty and old school in one sense. The way I present it is very much new school. So I'm not afraid of technology. I'm not afraid of advancements. But there's something quite sinister about being able to fool people about certain projects and products that people put out that aren't actually real. I mean, it completely fooled me for a second. I'll put the images up online, and now you know that they're AI. You'll immediately see that it's AI. And back then, AI images were in their infancy, and it was, I think, well, not in their infancy, but they weren't as good as they are right now. So I wasn't expecting it. So, but now you'll see it. You'll be like, oh, it's obviously AI. But it got me thinking, how long is it going to be before people look at, I mean, this could be any industry, but Leathercraft products and go, that looks too perfect, that's AI. I mean, are we there yet? I mean, I don't think there's many creators who love the art of creating something and making handmade things. I don't think that the Leathercraft community that I speak to are really going to embrace completely false and fake goods that don't actually exist to pass off as their own. It's a very different mindset. So I don't think it's going to be a huge problem, but it might be. Some people might find it very tempting to do. And I wonder if it's going to get to a point, a bit of a halfway house, where people will take pictures of their leatherwork and then get AI to enhance it. I mean, I know you can do that on Photoshop already, but you need skill on Photoshop to do that. But you could create a prompt, use an existing image and say, this is the edge, I want you to make it look perfect. This is the stitching, I want you to perfect the stitching so that it's all consistent. How long is it? I mean, that might be here already, I don't know. But it's kind of worries me a little bit. So it's a case of, I think, almost like buyer beware. You should really, at this point in time, be quite skeptical of images and trust video a little bit more. That advice will be outdated in the next few years, I think, where AI video, which is quite obvious at the moment, especially if it's an elaborate video, you'll pick up on it that something's wrong. But I think at the moment, when someone's taking a short video of something that they've made, what you see is what you get. They might be able to show it off in good lighting. They might even be able to put a little bit of a filter on it, but you're going to kind of see through that, and you'll get a good idea of whether or not something that someone's made is the real deal, or if it's good or it's not good. Whereas on an image, it's getting harder and harder to trust images now. So what I'll say is this: use a skeptical eye. When you see something on social media, just know that it may not be real. So if you're looking at your own leatherwork and then you're looking at these images, you might be as good as that already, or you might be better because the thing you're looking at doesn't even exist in the first place. That's subject number one, the use of AI, whether or not I think it's good. I mean, don't get me wrong. I've used it myself. For example, when I write a blog, what I like to do sometimes is I'll go into ChatGPT and say, give me the top 10 most commonly asked questions to do with leatherwork, or to do with bag making, or to do with wallet making, or to do with beginners starting in leathercraft, and it will give me a list, and then I'll go through that and go, oh, that's an interesting subject, I could talk about that, or that's not so good, and it can give me an idea of what to talk about. I won't do that very often. It's usually I know what I'm going to talk about in advance, but sometimes I will use that to go, oh yeah, I didn't even think of that, that's a good idea, I'll write a blog about that. I did once get ChatGPT to write me, when I was first playing around with it, I thought, let's get it to write me a blog about burnishing or hand stitching or something like that. And I think when it comes to more niche subjects, it struggles a little bit more and gives some really kind of generic, wishy-washy advice that's kind of like, really boring. It's got no juice to it. Do you know what I mean? Like it was, oh, you can burnish an edge using water. Some people like to use toconol or other types of gum, such as gum tragacanth. You can burnish using a wood slicker, or you can use canvas and it's just like, yeah. I mean, you're not wrong, but there's nothing in there. There's no juicy subject. There's no like quick hack that anyone can do to try out, and it's like, oh my god, it makes a big difference. There's none of that in there. I've even got ChatGPT to read my blog and just improve it and make it better. And I don't know, there seems to be something just a bit disingenuous about it and inauthentic. If I've got mistakes in there, or I haven't elaborated on something that I should have elaborated on to make it make more sense, that's okay. That's on me. It's something that I created, and it's never going to be perfect. And if there's something I didn't mention in there that should be mentioned, people can ask in the comments and interact with me, and we can have an entire conversation. It's the human element. It's the community. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just a piece of me which is imperfect, put out there for people to help them, to entertain them, and maybe even make them laugh about my own mistakes. That's fine. And you just don't get that from AI. I think it has its place, but I think it's permeating into areas that it probably shouldn't. And that's my thoughts. So the next one is the mirror polish burnish. Is it worth it? And this is a subject I get asked a lot about. No one's ever asked me, is it worth it? But they say, how can I do this? So I get people emailing me on social media, doing screenshots of someone's work that they've seen where they've got these, beautiful, perfect mirror polished edges, or as the cool kids like to call it, candy edges. I can't stand that. I really don't like the phrase candy edges. I don't know why it irks me. It's a bit like the word chops. Nothing wrong with it, but I just don't like the word. Or spuds, which is another word for potato. I don't know, maybe I'm getting old and grumpy, but just certain words or phrases that you're just like, ugh, no, don't like that, for no particular reason. Candy edges just irks me. Anyway, back to the mirror polish. Is it worth it? Okay, in a nutshell, my opinion, no, it's not. And here's the reason why. When people mirror polish an edge, and we're really talking a burnished edge using vegetable tanned leather, most people are using some kind of burnishing compound. To get those polished edges, they're using various grits of sandpaper, up to very, very fine grits that almost burnish the edge in themselves, like 2000 grit and beyond. And using waxes that tend to hold a polish better. For example, Columbus wax, which I'm not sure what's in that. Another one that I've used quite successfully in the past, which is Knorber wax. And they're very hard waxes, and they can be quite brittle. So if you build up too much of a thickness, it will crack when flexed. So wax being quite soft, even hard waxes, they don't tend to hold that perfectly mirror polish for very long. Mostly. I mean, all it takes is a few fingerprints of it touching, a wallet with those edges on, going in and out your pocket a few times. It doesn't last long. It doesn't hold that polish. So it is realistically a temporary finish, which works well on social media to get interest, likes, sales, you name it, depending on what the individual creating these projects is trying to do. I feel like once you start using these products with these mirror polished edges, it loses that very quickly. Very, very quickly. And if it's a product that flexes a lot, like a bifold wallet, and you've polished everything to the highest degree, with a little bit of opening and closing and going in and out the pocket, it really doesn't hold it. It will hold a reasonable edge. Once it comes down to a reasonable edge, it holds it for a bit, for longer. But it comes down to that level very, very quickly. It's kind of, I guess, equilibrium, unless you're accidentally rubbing it against a brick wall. So the finer the polish, the quicker it is to show marks and scratches and damage is the main thing. You can, and I've done it before, use a top coat. I think a few brands do this, edge paint makers. I use one by Giardini. It's a gloss top coat, I believe it's called. It goes on in like a milky white finish, and it dries level and clear. It's almost like, patent leather. It's a synthetic layer on the surface that sits there. Yes, you'll lose the gloss with some fingerprints, but you can just wipe that off and it's gone and it's back to a mirror polish. So unless you're using some kind of synthetic compound on your work, a mirror polish doesn't last very long, at least not my experience. Now, if you know a way of doing this naturally, just using waxes and gum finishes and sandpapering, that's fine. But I do wonder sometimes when people create these edges, spending 5 hours making the product and 3 hours finishing the edges, when customers get them and they look at it and it's shining and they can see their own reflection in it and it starts to degrade very, very quickly, I wonder if people get a little bit upset with it or feel that they've been done over a little bit. I don't know. I've never seen any evidence of that. But if I were to get something that was really finely finished and it lasted about as long as a tuna sandwich, I would probably be a bit upset by that and contact them going, "Hi, it was really shiny, but take a look at this," and then it's like a really dull edge. And most customers aren't going to have the skill to bring that back. And there's always also a trade-off. I mean, to get a reasonable burnished edge doesn't take more than a few minutes realistically. If you have a clean cut finish, bevel the edges, doesn't need any sanding, put your compound straight on, use a slicker, and within a few seconds you start to hear that tick, 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 tick of it drying and it's starting to burnish. You get a really reasonable edge. It doesn't take very long at all. But to get an absolute polished edge can take sometimes hours. Of people I've heard, sitting in front of the television with a piece of 3000 grit in their hand and a few rags and different waxes, and spending hours just finishing the edges for something that really doesn't last long. So there is a trade-off between how polished you can get it and its durability level, and whether that's worth it to you. Well, that's a question you have to answer yourself. So I like to go to what I call a practical edge. I like it to be shiny. I like it to reflect the light, and I like it to be nice and smooth without any voids in there or any obvious flaws. It should be nice and clean cut from the start. I don't take it to the level where I could literally use it to take an eyelash out of my eye because it's like a mirror. I like that practical edge because I know after some use it's going to look pretty much the same, and it's that kind of consistency that I like. As long as there's nothing that stands out on it that draws the eye and you think to yourself, "Oh, there's something wrong with that. I can see that there's a void there or there's a gap there." That is not acceptable to me. But a practical, shiny edge doesn't have to be mirror polished. I think is much more effective. Some things can hold a polish better than others. I think a solid leather belt, for example, if you get really nice edges on there, when you're putting it through the belt loops all the time, you're essentially repolishing it every time it goes through. If you're wearing a pair of jeans, it's like running it through 5 pieces of canvas every time you put it on and take it off. So it's that kind of thing is going to hold its polish a little bit better than, say, a briefcase where it could be scuffing against elevator doors or rubbing against a door frame or something. So mirror polish, is it worth it? That really is up to you, in my opinion. Taking it to that degree, spending that much time on something that isn't going to last very long, I think I prefer taking it to a practical edge, which is something that looks good, looks neat, but I haven't spent many hours working on it. And at the end of the day, the last thing I want is for all the attention that people kind of look at or remark at is just the edges and not the piece, not the design, not the creativity or the construction of what I've made. The only thing that people can remark on is, "Oh, wow, look at those edges." This might be a bit harsh, but that would be a failure in my opinion. If the only thing that stood out about my work was nicely finished edges, that's not quite, I think it's missing the point. Anyway, let's move on. So, number 3 of 4, leather drop-in linings. Now, when you make a bag, you tend to, a lined bag, more commonly what you'll see is you'll create the panels, the base, or the base and the gusset separately, and you will have the linings on each piece separately. And then you bring all the pieces together and you stitch them through. That might be for a bag that you create inside out and then flip it right side out afterwards, or it might be one that has cut edges on the outside where the stitching is visible on the outside. Whatever the case, more commonly when you create a lining, it is glued onto each panel piece, base, and gusset, usually around the edges, so it's loose in the center, so it's a little bit more flexible. And that's the common way of doing it. There's many different ways, obviously, but that's probably the most common. Now, a drop-in lining is where you create your bag, and on the inside it's completely unlined. And then what you do is you separately, like a completely different project, create a lining with the sides and the base and the gusset area, whatever it happens to be for that particular design. And then you literally, as the name suggests, drop it in. And then once you've dropped it in, you glue the edges together from the outside and the new lining, and then you can stitch them through. So that's really what a drop-in lining is. It's you're making a very slightly smaller version of your exterior, usually with a lining leather, okay, like a goat skin, calf skin, something soft, usually chrome tan leather. It could even be suede or something like that. You could even add pockets as well, and then you drop it in. So what are the benefits of a drop-in lining? Usually it's going to be softer. Like you could literally reach into the bottom, gather it up with your fingers, and then pull it out, okay, like inverting a sock. It's a separate bag, essentially, on the inside. So it's softer, it's a bit more relaxed. You tend to see it, I say, a little bit more often in tote bags, but that's not always the case. There's all sorts of bags that have them. They're sometimes less complicated to build. And I don't mean less time consuming, because you're essentially having to make two projects. But you can focus on making the bag itself, okay, the frame, the exterior, and then focus on making the drop-in lining, and then you marry them up at the end. So it can kind of separate that, so you're not having to construct the bag and a lining all in at the same time. You can separate them and bring them together at the end for the grand finale. So there is that benefit to it. So I'd say it's also easier to make pockets on it. So how do you measure? And this was the main question. How do you measure for a drop-in lining? And I'll mention a method of how you can measure, because it's going to be a smaller diameter than the exterior itself. You don't want to make it exactly the same, because it would, be a bit of a tight fit. But the main thing is, realistically, is creating a prototype, usually with just a cheaper material, something that you can test out. So you can go by your theory and then make it out of cheaper material and see if it fits. Then you can start cutting into premium leather linings and then start making that. So the way that I've measured in the past quite successfully is to take a long strip of the leather that you intend to use for the lining at the thickness that you intend to use, importantly. And what I do is take a thin strip. It only has to be like an inch wide, but as long as you can get it. And then what I do is I get double-sided tape on the back, place it down, pull the outside off, and then I tape it to the inside and go all the way around the inside of the bag, the interior, until it goes to the very end, and that thin strip of leather is now touching end to end. It's buttered up. That gives you the base measurement of the inside of the bag with that particular leather at that particular thickness. Okay, you change any of these variables, you need to retest it. Then you have to think, how many seams is this going to have? So you might have a bag that has, 4 main corners. So you have a drop-in lining with 4 main corners. So you think, okay, each seam is going to take up 10 millimeters of leather, because I'm going to have a stitch line 5 millimeters in from each edge. Okay, hopefully you're still with me on this. So you got 4 corners, each needs an extra centimeter to make up for the fact that you've got to stitch the edges together on all four sides, okay, all four corners. So you then take your overall measurement that you got, and you would add 4 centimeters to that, okay? It could be a little bit less than that if you tend to have your seam, 3 millimeters in from each edge. You have 2 edges there, 6 millimeters times 4. You get the idea. So that is essentially how you do it. And it's okay. If you get the math wrong or something doesn't go quite right, the next stage, which is prototyping your lining, and you only have to do this once. Once you've got your measurements, as long as you keep the leathers the same, the thickness is the same, you can repeat this over and over again and it will give the same result. You'll have that consistency. And this is to create a prototype. So even if you've created the exterior, you can still prototype for the interior before actually cutting into leather. I recommend using leather, cheap leather, like couch leather. You can get, cheap bonded leather that you would use for leather couches online on eBay. You can get them real cheap sometimes. And make a line. You don't have to stitch it all together. You can just glue it where the seams will normally go. So that's one way of doing it. Another one is using foam. So if your lining is 1 millimeter thick, which is a common thickness for a lining, you can get 1 millimeter craft foam. Do the same thing, just glue them in where the seam would normally go, drop it in, and then glue it to the sides, remembering that foam can compress a little bit, similar to leather, but foam can compress a little bit more, so it's a bit more forgiving in this sense. So you have to really keep an eye out for, is this too big or is it too small? And then you can make adjustments and you can remake the internal prototype or the drop-in lining prototype. Another one is thick canvas. If you get very heavyweight canvas, that's another reasonably inexpensive way to test it out. But again, once you've got the right measurements, once it fits in nicely and it's not incredibly baggy area and folded everywhere, then you can take those measurements, you can, prise it all apart, measure them, and then create a template, a pattern that you can cut out your lining leather with, and you should end up with something that fits and just drops in perfectly, and then you can glue the edges at the top, stitch it round, edge finish how you want to edge finish, and there you have your drop-in lining. So just to recap, don't measure the inside with, like a tailor's tape or something. You need to use the leather that you're going to use for your lining, and then make sure you add a seam allowance where the seams are going to go. So that's my advice on leather drop-in linings. Now, lastly, the final topic that I want to discuss is how to make durable leather cutting patterns. So this is something that most of us do. If you've been involved in leathercraft for a while, even if you're making a card holder, a small, very simply made wallet, it doesn't matter. Most people are going to usually start with some kind of pattern, usually made out of card, something that will hold its shape that you can either use to cut against with a craft knife, or something that you can use like a scratch awl to mark around and then finish off with a ruler and a craft knife. However you'd like to do it, most of us start with a pattern. Now, the most durable patterns, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, are, and I've seen anything from aluminium to brass, all sorts of high density fiberboard, hardboard. These things are great. They'll last a very, very long time, especially the metal ones. But you would have to have the equipment to cut that out, and it's not necessarily very cheap to get hold of, large sheets of brass, or zinc is another one, or aluminium. And it's going to involve cutting with a bandsaw, usually fitted with some kind of metal cut, a very fine tooth metal cutting saw blade. And not everybody has access to that. So how are you meant to create something durable, but yet you can still cut out with a craft knife? Now, if you've created a bag that you really like, perhaps you sell this bag and you've made a lot of them, you may have noticed that your patterns are starting to get a bit worn. The corners aren't as sharp. There's a few nicks where you've accidentally cut into the pattern. What can we do to make that more durable? So my kind of little idea, my little hack that I've had good success with in the past is to cut out with a craft knife either thick card, very thick cardstock, craft card, which is Kraft, which is the process of making heavyweight card, grey board is another one, or bookbinder's board, usually in the 1 to 1.5 millimeter range. 2 millimeters starts to get a bit thick, so if you have a very big pattern, that's fine, but when you have intricate patterns, when they're too thick, it's a little hard to cut around. Or another one, which is quite durable, is cellulose fiberboard. Okay, now these are all quite absorbent, which is good for what I'm going to suggest that you do next, which is to take super glue, okay, not thick super glue or gel super glue. I made the mistake of using that in a pinch once. It didn't make for a good experience. Take thin super glue, and all you have to do, making sure you're in a well-ventilated area, okay, is run a bead of super glue round the finished edge. So you've cut out your pattern to the dimensions of your project, and you're just making a bead all the way around and letting it soak in, okay? Put it to the side to completely cure, completely dry out. And then when you've finished, what I like to do is take a piece of fine grit sandpaper. Anything over 1,000 is fine. Against a piece of board, could be the same board that you used to cut out the pattern. And just gently, okay, just in one direction, just take off any high spots or bits of fiber that's sticking out, that's super glued in place, that your blade could catch on the way around. And just very gently sand it. That's all you need to do, just a little bit of sanding. And what you'll end up with is something that was easy to cut out, but the edges are literally as hard as fiberglass. So it's much harder for your knife to cut into by accident, and it's much more durable. So the corners are going to be, sharper for longer. The internal corners are going to be sharper for longer. And it creates something that I think really enhances your experience, but also the durability of the pattern, so that you don't have to resort to trying to spend a couple of days cutting out a bag pattern from sheet aluminium. Okay, so it's up to you. You might want to do that as a big project, but it's a really easy hack to do. You can even do it with thick cardstock, and 1 millimeter for smaller things like wallets, 1.5 maybe 2 for larger bags, so something within that range, and thin super glue. Okay, specifically thin super glue, or cyanoacrylate? I think cyanoacrylate, which is the generic term for the base of super glue. Okay, so that is it. Guys, if you have any feedback, maybe you disagree with something that I've said, maybe you have another idea to add on to something that I've talked about today, feel free to comment below and let me know what you think. If you want to share some ideas, that would be great. And if you're listening to this on YouTube or watching this on YouTube, should I say, don't forget to give me a like and turn on your notifications. So anytime I do drop a new podcast or video, you'll always be the first to know. In the meantime, thank you for listening to the Leathercraft Masterclass podcast with me, Phil, and I will see you, or you'll hear me, very, very soon. Take care.